Welcome to Media Melanie Talks TV. I'm Melanie, and today I'm back to talk about School Spirit Season 2 on Paramount Plus and go through one of the literal burning questions that I think the entire fandom has had since we knew that there was a fire in the first place. Who started the fire? I mean, we've got our obvious candidates of Mr. Martin and Janet, but Season 2 has also introduced a couple of potential other suspects. Could Eugene have potentially played a hand in starting the fire? Or what about these two ghostly apparitions that we've seen in the scar? We've got the girl with the half-burned face who may or may not be Janet, and then we've got the other ghost woman who said something like, we needed more time. Could one of these third-party ghost fire apparitions have been involved somehow, and there's a whole nother person that has started the fire that we didn't realize was even in play all along? Or what if it was started by some kind of other force or power, and Split River itself, the town, was actually built on hell? What if there is a portal to hell here and there's some sort of energy that brings these ghosts to a purgatory state until they cross over? Or if not a hell, is Split River some kind of purgatory perhaps where these spirits get caught? Especially now that we know that there are spirits both in the high school and the hospital. What about some other institutions in Split River? Will we see more ghosts in other places at some point? I am interested to find out, but we are here right now to discuss who set the fire. Before we get into some of the details though, please go ahead, hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe. I'm covering School Spirit Season 2 all season long. I have a reaction and review up for each episode, a weekly theory video, plus the next episode preview, so be sure you stick with me. Before we dive into the potential perpetrator of the fire, let's dive into some facts that we actually know. According to the newspaper that the ghost found at the school, the fire itself was on January 14th, 1958. Which is pretty interesting because the date on Janet's grave marker is actually April 30th, 1958. And regardless, 1958 is 2 years after Split River High School was built and founded, so it does seem like Mr. Martin and Janet were the first ghosts there. Unless this was potentially built on some sort of, I don't know, sacred ground, or there is some sort of supernatural energy within this town, and there have been ghosts there in the past who've moved on, got to the next plane, and then the afterlife kind of started fresh with Mr. Martin and Janet in 1958. But with the discrepancy in dates, could that just be a continuity issue and they didn't catch that? For a show that is so meticulous and so detailed with these twists and cliffhangers and red herrings, I've got to think it was on purpose. But why would Janet have died 3 months after the fire? Could she have been injured and her body was in a coma and we'll get some sort of tie-in with the hospital since we know Maddie's dad is there now? Or, I don't know, let's say Mr. Martin or Janet started the fire and then Janet ran off because she wanted to get away from her dad because he was not going to let her go to university. What if she was going to just kind of go into hiding and start a new life somewhere else, but for some reason was brought back to the school and ended up dying there anyway in a tragic twist of fate? I don't know, maybe, but why don't we start with some of our other potential perpetrators before we get into Mr. Martin and Janet, because obviously it does seem like one of those is the big antagonist here who started that fire to kick things off, whether intentionally or not. Let's talk about Eugene Bergstrom. This was a new character introduced here in Season 2, and according to IMDb, he only appeared in the one episode we've seen him, which is fascinating because I would have expected Nicole and the gang to go back to that storage locker he mentioned. Maybe they still will, and Eugene just won't be there. And if they do, what are they going to discover? What's really fascinating is the comment that Eugene made in terms of what he thought about the fire. He said directly to Nicole, neither Janet nor Mr. Martin would have made that mistake. They were incredibly meticulous. We know Eugene was Janet's lab partner and friend, and he probably knew her pretty well. Is it also possible that perhaps Eugene set the fire because he was jealous of Janet and Mr. Martin's relationship, and maybe he had a crush on Janet? But what doesn't make sense to me is why he would even bring it up to Nicole. He's in his 80s, he's in this nursing home, Red Pine Village. Could he be bringing it up because there is some residual guilt surrounding it and he wants to get it off his chest? Or is this why there was a cold case mentioned in one of the articles that we saw the ghosts have in terms of Split River still trying to get to the bottom of this cold case? is the mention of the cold case because Eugene has been trying to speak up about this incident over the years and nobody believed him still? So I'm not sure that Eugene was actually responsible for it. I mean, could he have been? Absolutely, but he didn't die. You would think that if he was responsible for it, he probably would have got caught in the flames and also have been a ghost, but he didn't. Was he really that smart and he set the fire with them in there and he was the only one able to escape? The newspaper article did mention that other students blamed the fire on Mr. Martin. So if Eugene doesn't think it's Mr. Martin, does that mean that it could be him? Or does that mean there is a whole nother person at play that we have not even thought of yet? Could it be one of the ghost apparitions that we saw in Janet's scar? There are two of them. We saw burned-faced girl, and then we saw the girl who said we needed more time. Half burned-faced girl said she was robbed, which if it was Janet, I mean, it didn't completely look like her. I will put up a picture and I mean, I guess decide for yourself, but to me, it does not look like Jessica Bohr. I mean, okay, maybe a little bit, and she is burned, so I don't know. When she said she was robbed, I first assumed it was Janet and she was robbed of her life and all of the scientific achievements that were playing out in that scar that we know that she never did actually achieve. If it's not Janet and somebody else was robbed, could that half-burned face have been the same as the brunette woman ghost that we saw without the burned face? They don't look the same to me either. And why is this other woman saying they needed more time? This could be crazy. What if this was the body of somebody that Janet had actually inhabited at some point during her 60 plus years being in the afterlife here at Split River? I found it odd that they did note all of these different achievements that obviously she never did. Could Janet have somehow taken over somebody's body and accomplished all of these things? I mean, I would assume if that was the case, the friend group would have known, Eugene would have known, so I think this is all just nonsense. But we do have to explore every single angle. And could this ghost apparition have been Alice, Mr. Martin's fiance? What's interesting about that is we saw a picture labeled Alice Thompson at Wally's reunion. The strange part is that the actress who plays the We Needed More Time ghost apparition is named Alice on IMDb. Is that an error or not? Now, could it be possible that Mr. Martin was engaged to this Alice Thompson? Maybe she was another teacher at the school. However, the picture of her looked completely different. She was blonde in the picture, brunette in the scar. People can dye their hair. Absolutely, that is definitely a thing. So what if Mr. Martin's fiance, Alice, was a teacher at the school and she ended up dying later? And that's why they didn't give her the same kind of memoriam moment of silence as they did for Wally at the reunion. And if it is Mr. Martin's fiance, Alice, and they needed more time, she could have just been also referencing the fact that she needed more time with her fiance in this world, and she was completely robbed of having it with him. I would really like to know, do you think that half burned face ghost girl is the same as We Needed More Time ghost woman? Or do we think they're two different apparitions? And do we think the half burned face is Janet or not? I'm really still up in the air with this, and I'm hoping we get some succinct answers going into the last 2 episodes of the season. Now, could it also be possible that Janet did in fact have another boyfriend? At one point, I believe she referenced some sort of poem that she wrote for him. What if Janet had a boyfriend and he's the one that started the fire because he was jealous of Mr. Martin and Janet's relationship, and we just haven't met him yet, and maybe he wasn't Eugene, but that's who Eugene was referring to? I mean, Eugene has to have been referring to somebody else if it's not him, and he doesn't believe Mr. Martin and Janet did it. But just real quick, circling back to Eugene's comment again about being meticulous, that also kind of makes me think that if they were so meticulous and the fire still happened, were they doing it on purpose? And that's what Eugene was alluding to? Whew, we'll get more into the Mr. Martin and Janet of it all soon, but first, let's talk about the possibility that maybe Reverend Hamilton, Janet's dad, started the fire. We know for a fact that he did not like what was happening between Mr. Martin and Janet. He did not want people in the town getting the wrong idea, seeing a teacher driving his student home. And he did kind of threaten him, and then we know that Mr. Martin ended up losing his position, which we can assume was due to Reverend Hamilton coming into the school and saying, hey, this is making me very uncomfortable, and because he was probably a pillar of the community despite being a complete a-hole, the school probably believed him. They did not want any type of a scandal, and perhaps That's why they could have blamed the fire on Mr. Martin. I mean, the newspaper article did say that it was a beloved teacher who was responsible for it. So does that mean that other students were also there watching? Or was it Mr. Hamilton? And this is all one big cover-up, and maybe that's who Eugene was referencing after all this. Maybe Mr. Hamilton got upset. Perhaps he got the wrong idea about the embroidered lab coat that Janet received from her grandmother, Ruth. What if he didn't believe it was from Ruth and he thought it was from Mr. Martin, and in fact, they were continuing whatever this relationship was, whether or not it was romantic or platonic? But if that set him off, he goes to the school, he gets Mr. Martin fired, and then discovers that even after he lost his job, that there's still something going on. What if he returned to the school, started that fire, and what if he also maybe died in that fire or potentially died as a result of injuries from the fire? Because we don't see his death date on his tombstone when Janet/Maddie visits it. So are they obscuring that for a reason because he was potentially involved? I mean, it's definitely possible. The man was threatening Mr. Martin with a legit axe, and who's to say that he wouldn't burn it down? He's a reverend. Maybe he believes that Mr. Martin should burn in the fires of hell for the way that he's been carrying on with his daughter. It's definitely possible, right? And let's say something did happen to Reverend Hamilton and he did die as a result of the fire. In one of my previous theory videos, I talked about who on earth could be Janet's brother, Dale. What if Janet's mom and brother ended up moving to Split River? They ended up, she ends up remarrying, changing her last name, and perhaps there is, again, this family relation between the Hamiltons and someone in the present day. I'm still not ruling that out, and you'll have to watch my theory video to see exactly who I think that this relation could be. It all plays in together. Let's say Reverend Hamilton did have a hand in this. That would explain the potential present-day familial relation with his wife and son moving somewhere else. And one more thing that I thought was kind of interesting, when we had Maddie/Janet at the farmhouse and she saw the ghost of her dad pulling up, he was the same age that we saw in the flashbacks with Mr. Martin and Janet. So does that mean that he actually died at that age as well? Or is it just that she's seeing him at that age because that's when she died and that is her last memory of him? I mean, I suppose it could go either way. And you know, the rules of the afterlife, a little loosey-goosey here, but I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think Reverend Hamilton could be the perpetrator who started the fire and inadvertently killed his daughter and Mr. Martin, even if he was only intending to kill Mr. Martin? I mean, if that's the case too, then we can't rule out the fact that perhaps he self-deleted over the guilt of having killed his daughter Janet when that wasn't necessarily his intention and he was just going after the school for revenge or potentially targeting Mr. Martin himself. All right, so let's talk about Janet as the potential perpetrator. Now, there is a Reddit thread on there. The Reddit post is by Not Super Festive, and then there's a comment in there by Gefalo. I'm going to put the link to this Reddit post here in the comments so you can go and read it, and I will show it here on the screen. What if Janet's father set the fire in 1958? Janet's father is obviously a very bad guy. He seems to be easily able to put his hands on Janet without remorse and probably wanted to do the same thing to Mr. Martin during their interaction by his car. The Reverend wasn't carrying that axe around for nothing, right? I think Janet and Mr. Martin talked about college more after he drove her home that day. While they were talking, possibly after school hours, Janet's father drove to the school to pick her up the day of the fire. Maybe he went into the class, overheard them talking about the sciences, how she's gifted, which is clearly his issues with it. And I think the fire's a cover-up. I think Janet's father saw them talking, killed them both. Janet's father caused the fire after seeing what he did, went home, and offed himself because of the guilt. That's why we see the ghost when Janet as Maddie is hiding in the house right before she sets the fire. I mean, it's definitely possible. It's kind of what I was just mentioning. But to go one step further, we have the cyanide comment. So in this post by Gefalo, I have a theory that Janet killed her father. In the car with Mr. Martin, she discusses cyanide and how some people can't taste or smell it. Janet is reduced to preparing supper for her father every day instead of following her dreams to go to college. She obviously knows how to make it with her scientific knowledge. I think after the interaction with Mr. Martin and her father, she was distraught and sought to free herself from him any way she could. So she slipped it into his food. Maybe when she went to school and told Mr. Martin of what she had done, if he wasn't involved in the idea, then an argument took place and the fire that killed them both was accidental and they were both in distress. I think that cyanide theory could have some legs. I mean, why else mention the cyanide in the first place? Could it tie into something Janet was doing with her dad? Or perhaps could it have been some tragic Romeo and Juliet thing and Janet gave it to Mr. Martin and then took it herself? Or, I mean, could the cyanide have actually been flammable and caused the fire by accident? It's a really good theory, and I am not going to rule it out. And speaking of Janet, she also makes a comment at some point during the season when she says, "You don't know what I'm capable of." That could have two different meanings. It could mean, you don't know what I'm capable of, I burn this whole thing down, or you don't know what I'm capable of in terms of I have so much more potential being born in this day and age where I won't be able to live to my full potential and achieve the goals that I want. I'm not sure which one it means. I'm kind of leaning towards the latter. They do a great job really going between Mr. Martin and Janet being the antagonist here, but I don't know, the more we go, I kind of think Mr. Martin may have played more of a hand in this than Janet, and perhaps he was deceiving her and the entire group this whole time. But another thing that doesn't sit right with me in line with this "you don't know what I'm capable of" comment is the fact that we see Janet and Maddie's body burn down the farmhouse. She set a legitimate fire. Is she doing that because of all of the trauma it caused her and she just wants to release it somehow? Or is she a complete pyromaniac and this is not her first fire rodeo? And I mean, in terms of motive, it's very clear. Obviously, there's a couple of different motives for Janet. She's bitter because she's not going to be able to live the future she wants, go to college, become a famous chemist or scientist someday. If she was bitter over her dad having relieved Mr. Martin of his job at the school, I mean, it could just be sadness. It could be revenge against her dad, could be revenge against the school. But the question we have to really ask ourselves, whether or not it's Janet or Mr. Martin, is, did they do it on purpose or was it an accident? It all comes back to Eugene's comment about them being very meticulous. So if they did do it on purpose, they very much did it on purpose because they are both very smart people who never would have let that happen based on all of the skills, knowledge, and training that they have. Or was this just a complete accident and they were meticulous and something else happened that maybe made things get out of control a little bit and the fire started, but really neither one of them were necessarily at fault. It could have just been a bad turn of luck, wrong place, wrong time, an accident in the lab. I mean, it did seem like they spent a lot of time in there together. So whether or not Mr. Martin or Janet said it, I think the more interesting part will be to see if it was deliberate or if it was accidental. But let's say it was Janet or Mr. Martin, either way, that discrepancy in the death date with Janet is interesting to me. We know obviously her spirit's at Split River High School, so it makes sense that she did die there, but why was the date different on the tombstone? Again, is it a continuity error, or could Janet have had some severe injuries, ended up in a coma perhaps, and then ended up dying later, but her spirit stays at the high school because that's where the incident that ultimately caused her death occurred? And how does the hospital play into it with Maddie's dad now being there? I'm really hoping we get more closure and context on that. And hopefully, I mean, gosh, imagine if Maddie and her dad end up having a reunion because Janet ends up swapping bodies with Maddie. That would be an interesting twist as well. Okay, so if we're talking about Mr. Martin being the bad guy and starting the fire here, I mean, it did sound like he kind of admitted it before and said it was his fault, but was it an accident or on purpose? If Mr. Martin wanted revenge against the school, maybe he was just coming back to burn down the lab and make a statement, cause a scene, show them who's boss, and just run out into the sunset away from Split River and go be a scientist somewhere else? Or did he set it deliberately and he actually wanted to die because he felt like there was nothing left to live for? That would maybe give some credence as to why we saw this other ghost in the scar. And if it is Alice, his fiance, then perhaps the scar is some sort of regret. But my real question is, if it is Mr. Martin's fiance, why is she in Janet's scar in the first place? I mean, is there a possibility that this is actually Mr. Martin's scar? Because I can't reconcile the fact that we have these two different ghostly apparitions in here. We've never seen the one that doesn't have the burned face before. So if it is Alice, Mr. Martin's fiance? What is she doing there? And if she is there, does it show that perhaps she did get jealous of Janet and she is tied into Janet's scar because Janet took her fiance away from her and now she's kind of haunting that scar? What do you guys think? What do we make of these ghostly apparitions in the scars? Who are they? And why did we have that Alice picture next to Wally's with very little explanation? And we have the actress on IMDb as Alice, who is the actual ghost apparition. My mind is moving in circles, you guys. And then back to Mr. Martin for a minute. Let's say he did start the fire, or if it was an accidental thing in which, he killed him and Janet, I would imagine that guilt would be more prevalent with him. I mean, it does seem like him and Janet, worked together for years and years, but what ended up making him lock Janet in that boiler room not long after giving her that watch at the birthday party? The watch was meant to be a gift, which I always assumed was the key to the scar to let Janet in so she could cross over. But why then would he lock her up? We know that there are the exit signs there now. Was she looking for her exit sign this whole time and it's never there because she's still waiting on some kind of closure, similar to how Dawn got closure and seemingly walked through the exit sign once she got there? I asked myself in the reaction and review video this week, does every scar have an exit door, or does it only show up after the closure is met and they are able to cross over? Like, would Maddie have been able to just walk through that door? I don't necessarily buy that. And it doesn't seem like there is an exit door within Janet's scar because Maddie saw that in Dawn's. And now that we know all these scars are connected in some way, I'm really curious to see how the exit door of it all plays into each other. All right, I'm going to end this with my last and most wild theory. What if Mr. Martin or Janet or Eugene or anybody for that matter, what if no human started the fire? What if Split River, the town, is in fact a metaphor for purgatory, for a gateway to either heaven or hell when the spirits cross over? We know there are ghosts at the high school. We know there are ghosts at the hospital. Could there be ghosts in other institutions around Split River that maybe we haven't even seen yet? And could this just be a cursed type of town where there's some sort of big energy, or it's built on something that is causing all of these deaths at one high school? Because seriously, if I'm a parent and all these kids are dying at these high school, who continues to send their kids there? It is giving completely cursed vibes. And what if there is this sort of spiritual, supernatural energy here and it does somehow trap souls, and there's a much bigger picture to it all, and nobody started the fire. In fact, it was a spontaneous thing to start this cycle of getting more ghosts in the afterlife here in Split River. I've talked about the river Styx a little bit, being kind of the gateway between the world of the living and the dead. And what if Split River is a metaphorical river Styx? I've also had someone in my comments talking about the fact that this could be related to the House of Usher, which is another kind of evil, supernaturally type of show. Maybe there is some bigger evil force at play here, and perhaps Mr. Martin and Janet just got caught up in all of it, happened to be the first ghosts after the school was built, and they kick off these experiments to try to get to the bottom of it. What if their experiments weren't as focused on the trauma and the keys? And yes, I know that they were obviously looking into those, but what if they were looking into bigger picture things as well, and they discovered something even bigger about the high school? And could they know there are other ghosts in Split River? That would be wild. And we know the cast have said, think about whatever the bad news ending is going to be. It's even worse than that. Could that be the worst thing that could happen? Potentially. That was fun. This is a video I've been wanting to do all season long, and I'm glad I waited until now when we had just a little bit more information regarding Eugene, regarding this other apparition that we've now seen within the fire scar. I would really like to know, what do you guys think? Who started the fire? Will we get an answer before the end of season 2? I sure hope so. I'm hoping that they wrap up some of these loose ends, that they end on a really great cliffhanger and propel us into a third season. And yes, please give us that renewal news. I think we are all ready for it. Really appreciate you tuning in. Like I said, I've tripled down on my school spirits coverage, so every week I've got a reaction and review, a theory video, and then an episode preview. So yes, I will be back in a couple of days with an episode 7 preview as well. Be sure to like this video. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you like videos where I talk about TV shows like this, then you may enjoy some of my others as well, including Severance on Apple TV+, Paradise on Hulu, and The White Lotus on HBO Max. I really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you so much, and I'll be back again soon. Media Melanie, clicking off.